WNK TV. And then at this point, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Donna and Ben, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chairman McGinnis, and thank you for having us, council members, this afternoon to talk to you about this really important study that we have completed. And we wanted to give you the what the study was about in terms of Salt Creek flood resiliency and also the recommendations. I'm not going to take too much time because I'm going to turn it over to Ben and Brian, and I'll step in later. But anyway, I want to first of all introduce Brian Dunnigan from Olson. You can wave at us, Brian. He has a very long history of water in Nebraska, worked for the Nebraska DNR, and now we have the benefit of his expertise to help us with this important study. I don't think Paul Zillig is on right now, but he was going to join us to kind of talk to us, answer questions. He is the general manager of Lower Platte South NRD. And of course, we have Ben Higgins, our own Ben Higgins, our stormwater superintendent, who's going to kick the presentation off. So with that, Brian, if you'll turn on the presentation, we can get started.
Sure, everybody can see that. And if they can, I'll let Ben proceed.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Brian. I very much appreciate it. I wanted to talk to you today about the Salt Creek Floodplain Resiliency Study. If you could advance the slide one, Brian. So anyway, this is a study that we started a year or so ago, and it was done by the City of Lincoln and the Lower Platte South. And of course, we had Olson do the project, and they brought in a couple of international firms, Michael Baker and Wright Waters, to help out, do some of the stuff more on a national scale. So what we did this project for, as you all probably remember, we had some pretty big flooding in 2014. Then again, in May of 2015, we had some massive flooding along Salt Creek. And we already knew that most people don't know this, but they updated the national standards for rainfall back in 2014 or so with NOAA Atlas 14. And so previously our rainfall records were from the 1960s. And so they've updated those. And so we all know, and we've had ample evidence of it, of climate change with a lot more frequency of heavy flooding and a lot more hotter weather. And so we thought, well, let's take a look at Salt Creek and see what we're going to happen to have in the future, because we definitely want to be more resilient for that. So go ahead, Brian. So we studied Salt Creek. As you well know, Salt Creek is a major creek in Lincoln. It kind of runs through downtown. All the creeks in Lincoln feed into it. You have Antelope Creek, Beal Slough, Oak Creek, Cardwell Branch, Stevens Creek, all feed into that. So it's kind of the major backbone of Lincoln and runs through Lincoln. So it's really important for us to understand what we have now and what we're going to have in the future. So if you want to take it from there, Brian.
Great, thank you, Ben. I think it's really important before we get started to kind of get some nomenclature down, and to start out with, we'll just talk about how we defined resiliency for this particular study. And we defined it very simply as the ability to meet the challenges of today and safeguard against the uncertainties of the future. How can we do this? Well, one way is to make sure we consider how climate and land use in Lincoln may change in the next 50 to 80 years based on what we know about climate science. And we did a very thorough evaluation of that we'll talk about in just a second. A couple other terms that are always important when we talk about floodplains and floodplain management. We'll just start out with what floodplain management is. And for our discussion, it will be community-based efforts to prevent or reduce flooding risk. And that really makes for a resilient community. When we talk about the 100-year flood or the 500-year flood, and all my days in this business, that's one of the most confusing terms that we come up with. It has nothing to do with years really. It has everything to do with probability and statistics. It's simply, if we're talking about the 100-year flood, what's commonly referred to as a 100-year flood, we're talking about a flood that has a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. That's it. So you could have back-to-back 100-year floods. Statistically, that is possible. If we're talking about a 500-year flood, we're talking about a flood that has a 0.2% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. The other thing that we're going to spend a little bit of time on this afternoon talking about are non-structural floodplain management measures and structural floodplain management measures. And just to set those up, when we talk about non-structural floodplain management measures, we're really talking about those measures where we modify the susceptibility of the flood to humans and to structures. So we're talking about things like relocating structures out of the floodplain or elevating structures above the 100-year floodplain, things like that. When we talk about structural floodplain management or structural floodplain measures, we're really talking about modifying the flooding source. So that would include measures like dams and reservoirs and levees, for instance. So those are the bigger types of projects. So with that understanding, I think we're ready to kind of dig into what we did in the study and what we found. First of all, there was a stakeholder committee that was formed right at the start of the project, and that committee helped direct us on what the understanding of the issues were and take information back to their constituents about what was going on with the study. There were 29 stakeholders that were invited to be part of the stakeholder committee. Council members Jane Raybould and Roy Christensen were invited to attend. City county staff included Donna Garden, Ben Higgins, Chad Blaha from Building and Safety, Paul Barnes from the Planning Department, James David Saver from Lancaster County Emergency Management, and we had representatives from a variety of different organizations and groups, including the Home Builders Association, the university, the Airport Authority, LES, Friends of Wilderness Park, and a number of other individuals and neighborhood associations. There were 3 meetings that were held, one in September of 2019, one in October of 2019, and the last one we held virtually in April of 2020. And that's when the public education plan was presented to the stakeholders. There also is a website, and we'll show that again at the end of this presentation, but all of the information from the stakeholder committee and groups were part of, are shown on that particular website at saltcreekstudy.com. So when we look at the study, what did we look at? Well, let's talk about it. We looked at basically 6 different areas, and I'll start over on the left-hand side of this slide and kind of work across, and there's a few that I want to go into more detail. But to start with, we did review best management practices from across the country, both from an organizational standpoint and from a community standpoint. We looked at those organizations and communities that were doing the best practices in floodplain management, and they included organizations like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Resilient Nation Partnership Network, the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, and the National Academy of Science. We also looked at communities, sometimes much like Lincoln, that were taking proactive approaches to floodplain management and were really getting into things that we thought would be a benefit to Lincoln to look at least. Those included Beatrice, Nebraska, Boulder County, Colorado, Cedar Falls, Iowa, Fort Collins, Colorado, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, Papillion, Nebraska, Platte County, Missouri, and Shawnee, Kansas. So you can see there was quite a cross-section of organizations and communities that we looked at. The next thing that we took a look at in the study was what Lincoln, the Lower Platte South NRD, and the county had done in the past with floodplain management, and specifically what had been done in the Salt Creek floodplain. And just to state, first and foremost, Lincoln has been very proactive in their floodplain management program over the years, and that is reflective with their community rating system score that we'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. We also looked at all of the studies that had been done in the more recent past since 1956 on. We looked at about 21 studies. We summarized those studies for information which really become the foundation of what we can look at in the future, or what we should look at in the future. We looked at local climate resiliency standards, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail. So I'll just leave that there. Then we also summarized and recommended potential flood reduction measures. I'll talk about that in more detail. And then we prepared that public education and dissemination plan and looked at funding alternatives. So let's take a deeper look at this. One of the very important elements of the study was to evaluate local climate and how this may change in the future. We did this in a two-step process. The first step was to look at how precipitation data that is a basis of our existing floodplain maps has changed. And Ben mentioned that. The existing data that we're using today actually dates from a paper that was published by the National Weather Service back in 1961. And what we wanted to see is how big of a change newer data would make to that precipitation data. So we used the newest data, which came out in 2013 from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, called NOAA Atlas 14. So that was one part of our analysis. The second step was to use the methodology that considers future greenhouse gas emissions and different scenarios and calculate future precipitation and flood discharges for Salt Creek. So that was a very comprehensive climate study that we did as part of this study. Some of you may recognize some of those graphs at the bottom of this slide. Particularly, I'd like to point out that CO2 concentration emission standard. These are called representative concentration pathways, or what we may expect in the future for greenhouse gases. We actually looked at two of these. And if you're familiar with which I'm sure you are, with the Climate Action Plan, these are the same RCPs that were looked at in the Climate Action Plan. We looked at RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, which when we look at RCP 8.5, that actually is what we refer to as the business as usual model, meaning that we don't take as society any drastic steps to reduce greenhouse emission, and across the world, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. The RCP 4.5 scenario says that within 20 years, we start getting a better handle on greenhouse gas emissions, and they start leveling off in about 20 years. So those were the two things that we looked at. And then in addition to future land use in the city going out to the year 2100. So let me kind of go over that for you again to kind of set the stage on what we compare and what we look at in this study. The top line represents where we are today and what we're looking at for data. We call that the existing condition. And again, it uses precipitation data from 1961 to calculate runoff and discharge information that's used in our current flood insurance rate maps. We then updated that data with the 2013 precip data, calculated runoff and discharge information for Salt Creek, and came up with new profiles, and they did change, and we'll look at those in a little bit. And the last thing we did is we took that updated precipitation data and then an ensemble of climate models and those representative concentration pathways, and looked at how that data would look in the year 2100 as far as new discharges go, and what new profiles for Salt Creek may look like with all of that information. So again, the existing data is what we have on the current flood insurance rate maps, updated data, updating to the current precipitation data through 2013, and future, meaning future climate through the year 2100. So let's get down to some of the results. If you take a look at the right side of this particular slide, I'm going to start talking about how those changes amount to changes in flood elevations. So if we look at the existing data today and compare it to the updated data, which is the new precipitation data, just new data up through 2013, so what has already happened, we see about an 0.8 of a foot rise in the 100-year flood. It would be greater than that for the 500-year flood, but let's just talk about the 100-year flood because it is the regulatory flood. If we look at the existing data, again, what's on the flood insurance rate maps today, and compare it to what we would find if we looked at future climate and updated data, we would see a nearly 2.2 foot rise in the 100-year floodplain in Salt Creek over what we see today. So you can see that what the climate scenarios and predictions are telling us is that we are going to have larger flood events for the more rare flood events in the future. Okay, the next thing that we wanted to take a peek at here was what are some of the recommendations that we have or that we've come up with for the non-structural flood reduction measures, given what we've looked at across the country for organizations and communities and what we see might be happening in the today and in the future as far as flooding goes. We have 6 recommendations for non-structural measures. The first one was overlay zoning, and that provides for additional zoning guidance and restrictions for development that is an additional layer on top of the base zone district. This could address things like building use, building standards, additional setbacks, and higher regulatory standards. The next thing we would recommend would be a voluntary buyout program. Lincoln has bought out properties in the floodplain before. Usually it's as a result of a project, but this recommendation really goes to having a sustained funding source for buyouts. And that's important because usually after a flood, there is federal money that is available on a matching basis. So if you do have a funding source that's available long-term for buyouts, it has proved advantageous to other communities in the country. Another recommendation is setbacks and riparian preservation. This is nothing new to Lincoln. Lincoln does a fantastic job of this and through the Lower Platte South Natural Resources District. So this is just something that would protect corridors and floodplains, maybe that are outside of the built environment right now, but could protect those in the future. And really progressively, that's what Lincoln has done throughout its history. The next recommendation would be low impact development regulations. The LID benefits are to stormwater quality improvements, reducing runoff rates, diminishing impacts of impervious surfaces. Currently, the city does have recommendations and water quality standards for new development and redevelopment, but this recommendation would be to consider making those mandatory. And of course, higher floodplain management standards. We really got these, some of these recommendations straight from Cedar Falls, Iowa. As you may recall, Cedar Falls had some horrendous flooding in the past. And one of the things that they found that would be very advantageous to them is if they raised the minimum standards a bit. For instance, the freeboard standard of elevating structures above the 100-year floodplain. Currently, the federal minimum standard is to elevate at or above the 100-year floodplain. Lincoln's standard is to elevate 1 foot above the 100-year floodplain, and a higher standard may be to have a freeboard requirement like 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain. You can also could consider future conditions mapping on the flood maps, which might be a really good community awareness piece also. And the last non-structural floodplain measure that we recommend was cluster subdivision regulations. And this is really for those sensitive areas where grouping structures on smaller lots outside flood-prone areas may be advantageous in allowing the flood to have more room in the floodplain and maybe even preserving open space and green space in those areas. So those were our 6 recommendations for non-structural measures. The other thing that we ended up doing as part of the study is we did look at some structural measures. As you probably know, there is a tremendous amount of flood control around the city of Lincoln right now that includes 10 federal dams and nearly 100 smaller natural resource district dams and private dams. Together, all of those structures control about 45% of the watershed surrounding Lincoln. So there's still 55% of the watershed that is uncontrolled, and that uncontrolled discharge is the discharge that can go through the levied floodplain system. So one thing that we did on this particular task is we looked to see what would be possible on a conceptual level, if we put additional flood control measures in the watersheds surrounding Lincoln, so we could really take a systematic approach to controlling flooding and to see if what it would take to limit the discharges through the leveed system to a flood elevation below the top of levee for both the updated condition, in other words, the current precipitation data, and for the future changes with climate. And what we found out is that we could limit discharges below the top of the current levee system for the new 100-year floodplain if, again, on a conceptual level, we controlled flooding and controlled those watersheds to an extent that would limit that discharge. And that amounted to 16 dams and a very rough cost without any benefit cost analysis to that of roughly $138 million. And that would, again, limit the flood elevations to below the top of the levee system. Again, we did prepare a public education plan that is available on the website and has some very good information about Salt Creek and just general information, frequently asked questions, things like that. That is available right now. We also looked at potential funding sources that Lincoln may use in addition to any other funding sources that could help with both structural and non-structural requirements. That really got to what we came down to as the final study recommendations. I will go through these, and then Donna will talk about these in a little more detail at the end of the presentation. But the 6 recommendations that we came up with after looking at everything that we did in the study was for Lincoln to continue active participation in the community rating system. And again, Lincoln is one of the foremost communities in the nation with a community rating system score of class 5, which means there's a 25% reduction for insurance premiums in the city of Lincoln. And there's some ways that Lincoln could even go above and beyond that. So that was a very important recommendation. Again, another recommendation would be to adopt higher floodplain regulatory standards. And we think this is really important given the fact that the risk is greater than what the flood maps currently show. We would encourage to initiate the development of new floodplain maps. That's quite an undertaking and does take a bit of time. So it's something that does require some planning to initiate. We would look at those national best management practices that we identified in the study to guide planning objectives in Lincoln, and those can be taken off the shelf at any time. So there's a good resource of everything that we looked at as part of the study. We would recommend considering implementation of the non-structural flood resiliency strategies that I just discussed. And finally, continue with the development of resiliency strategy for Salt Creek with the years to come and given the future climate scenarios that we've looked at. And with that, I will turn it over to Donna. And also there is the website, saltcreekstudy.com, that you can go and look at and see all the information that has been produced to date from the Stakeholder Subcommittee group. Donna.
All right, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that. And I've just got a couple of quick slides here to kind of summarize what Brian said. This one is a graphic that we use throughout this study to kind of show some of the different ways you can look at these types of things that Brian's recommended here, or the study recommends. Starting at the bottom, which is probably kind of the low-hanging fruit for us to be able to go ahead and start doing mapping and studies, the revision of the floodplain maps, education and outreach, making sure that those vulnerable areas know what to do in the event of a flood, and also just to make sure we're educating everyone in the city about these policies. But then talking about public policy, floodplain regulations, floodplain preservation, those are the very specific things that Brian spoke about that are the next grade up on this chart. And as you go up this chart, you can see that you get to the peak of it, which is probably the most expensive in terms of actually implementing, but actually putting in those structural measures out there in the county. This study really didn't focus on those that much, but we think there's probably some more steps, some more work that we need to do with regard to that. In regard to the buyouts, if that's a very voluntary program, this is something where we think we should start looking at some kind of pilot program for this, where we could put some money aside so that we would have this program in place in case we would like to go ahead and use it. These are the recommendations listed in a little bit different way. And what I've done is color coded them so that we can kind of tell what's in place, what's going on, so forth and so on. The green one, obviously the CRS program is very, very important to us. We've had a lot of work moving forward to give us the rating that we have. And we want to continue that good work with the community rating service. The yellow ones in yellow or orange are ones that we are actively working on right now. And they are in development. So looking at those different floodplain regulatory standards that we talked about with regard to minimum construction levels, minimum stream corridors, things like that that protect us in the future. Those are really in the works right now, and we'll probably be coming before you again with a more detailed information on that. And the purple ones are ones that we're considering in terms of getting started on floodplain revisions, floodplain map revisions, using those national BMPs, pulling them off the shelves, and that pilot voluntary buyout program that could be possible for us in the future. All of the other ones that are here are certainly on the recommendation list and could be for future consideration, but they're not being actively pursued right now. We may change that though in terms of moving forward with these recommendations. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Sandra, do you have a question for the group?
I do. Thank you so much, Richard. Donna, I had a question about cost of preparing new floodplain maps.
Yeah, and I think probably Ben and or Brian could help me out on this, but it is not an inexpensive endeavor. Not when you're
I didn't think so.
yes, when you're looking at a watershed of this size, we're probably talking somewhere. I'm going to look at Ben, $1 million, something about that much.
Yeah, we'd be talking a very, very high 6-figure number or a low 7-figure number. I'm thinking about $1 million plus, Brian. That's what I'm guessing. I mean, yeah, I think that's a pretty good ballpark.
I would agree, Ben.
Thanks.
Hey, Jane, do you have a quick question at this point?
Just real quick, who does the mapping? Because don't we periodically get from FEMA any updated mapping? You know, we've submitted to our insurance providers saying, hey, you know, this location is no longer in a flood prone area. So can we get a reduction in our insurance rates?
Sure, Ben, I can take the first crack at that. We'd actually be talking about a comprehensive redo of the maps. And what you'd be talking about would be site-specific updates to the maps, usually called letters of map amendment or letters of map revision. The last really comprehensive total update to the flood maps, I think, was in 2005 for the city of Lincoln, where all the panels were updated based on the most current information.
And then did we pay for that in 2005?
I think that was both the city and FEMA.
Okay.
And did they continue to use the technical paper 40 precipitation data for that, Brian? Do you remember?
They did, and the city also wanted to look at Salt Creek in kind of a novel way, which FEMA accepted and was very good for the city of Lincoln to look at it in those conditions. So it was a very good update for the city. We'd really be talking about something, again, a complete redo of the hydrology and hydraulics for the mapping.
Okay, kind of bumping up against our half hour. So I've got kind of a lot of, I think, small questions that I'll either call Ben and or Brian.
And we'd encourage you all that the report is available, so please, by all means, take a look at it, and there might spark some other additional questions that we'd be happy to help answer.
Great report.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We appreciate
Okay,
your
thanks.
time today.
Thanks,
Okay,
everyone.
I'll see you about 2:30. Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.